say those countries which have lost the possibility to make and the ability to make political compromise and laws, as we see it in big parts of the world, by the way, also in the home country of many of these companies, Congress in America is not able anymore to make good compromises and to make good laws, then we have a problem in democracy. So if it is so that democracy is under attack, then we have to ask a question: in which world do we want to live? Do we want to live in a world where technology and companies, the markets, capitalism, determine the rules of the game? Or do we want to still participate, at least, and have a say in making the rules? And of course, this say is never perfect, and it is not going to fulfill your dreams like you think your dreams are fulfilled when you push the buy button on Amazon. And attitudes here towards democracy have also changed through the internet. You know, people think if they don't get what they want, that's not democracy. That's, of course, a huge misunderstanding. So I think this technology moving on and colonializing our life leads us to ask very basic questions. If we don't ask them, very soon we will live in a world where actually we don't have a lot to say anymore. And at least for my part, I would say that's not how I want to live. So my plea is, let's not just speculate how things will go. Let's not just watch. Let's engage in the very hard battle for the good results in democracy. And that in democracy the results can also be bad. Well, I mean, you know, that is the nature of choice in democratic process. You know, you vote, and not only that, one can do much more than voting in terms of democratic engagement. But if people disengage and don't take charge anymore, the likelihood, I would say, that the results in the end are not to our liking, they increase. So I think my paper is also a call to reinvigorate democratic engagement in times where it may look like actually it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if I may say this, you know, don't want to talk too long, my experience is that on technological subjects you can actually see very clearly, also in the European legislative processes, that engagement does make a difference. You know, civil society does not always win, but it does win. We have had, you know, the discussion on TTIP, we had the discussion on the GDPR, on the data protection rules where, you know, big corporate was running in one direction and civil society was going in another direction. And I would say we wouldn't have this law today if civil society wouldn't have engaged, if there wouldn't have been Edward Snowden, if there wouldn't have been Max Schrems from Vienna. So if you look at the particular history of lawmaking in Europe over the last 10 years, there are great stories of engagement of civil society still to be told, which I would say, you know, we need to tell them, we need to talk more about them, because they are actually quite encouraging in terms of what difference in engagement will make.
Absolutely agree on that. My problem is that I was at a conference yesterday among legal scholars, and one was wondering what happens when algorithms start writing themselves. So, because our whole framework, legislative framework, is based on the fact that you can always trace back responsibility on the coder for what is written, basically. But we know that these self-learning algorithms are becoming more and more advanced, and of course they probably will start to do things by themselves and have like algorithm songs, let's say like that. And so again, how would you face such a threat, and would you go as far as to imagine to ban some kind of algorithmic functions or some kind of applications of AI that need to be banned in principle because they're inherently bad or inherently uncontrollable on a human perspective?
Well, we already have laws in the General Data Protection Regulation which say that every human being has a right to object to automated processing if the processing leads to decisions which are of legal nature or affect the person in the same way. So I think that's a very important principle, that humans should not become objects of machine decisions and machine control. And when personal data is processed, these rules, I think, go very far. But the question is what happens if it's not about personal data and still has huge impacts. And there I would say it is absolutely legitimate to think about limits of technologies. And we have a long history in Europe of banning also certain technologies or chemicals or substances. You know, you are in some member states of the European Union not allowed to build an atomic power plant anymore. You are not allowed to use many chemical substances which have beneficial effects but also have huge negative effects, and therefore they have been banned. So, you know, this idea that technology always primes and it's a problem of innovation to have laws which ban certain parts of technology, I must say I'm very relaxed about this. We have a long history of regulating technology in detail. Now let me say something about speech. And there we come to journalism, the subject of this conference. The core of journalism for me is criticism. It's power control, force as state function of journalism. And journalism is about also our dreams of how the future should be. So journalism confronts what should be with what is. And this is exactly what artificial intelligence cannot do. Because artificial intelligence, machine learning, learns on the basis of past empirics. So it can optimize within the system of past empirics, but it cannot go beyond the optimization of past empirics. It cannot answer the question, what should be as compared to what is. If the should be is a systemic change, a new approach, what humans find based on their dreams, based on their discontent, based on criticism, based on asking questions and probing and coming to the conclusion this is actually no good how we've done it in the past. We have to do it radically different. So I would say we have to be very, very careful in moving down this road with this technology which cements the past and which isolates us from the practice which leads to our discontent, and it is our discontent with our daily practice which leads us to question and criticize and overcome the daily practice and start something new. And if we hand over the daily practice more and more to these machines, we have to ask ourselves, where is the impetus for criticism, for discontent, for wanting to move on, to do radically new and different things going to come from? So I would say, therefore, for example, in journalism, it's a good example. I'm pretty convinced that the good journalism in terms of criticism, in terms of questioning, also in terms of deep investigation, will always be a human task. And if you look a little bit closer, one reads these stories about, wow, here's a text which looks like, and so on. If you really look at the programs which supposedly are really understanding language, it's actually very, very thin. In speech, what I have seen so far, and I've been around in many of university research places, is speech to text, meaning what I talk now will be written down by a machine, or a machine will read out in a language which sounds already quite human what's on paper, and translation. Those are the areas where fantastic progress has been made. Then, for journalists, there are some curation machines, some machines and programs which build very small news items based on numbers input, stock market, American sports, statistics heavy. But beyond that, it's very, very meager. And so I think we also have to be a little bit critical towards this hype on AI. Is it really going to bring the great progress in all areas? Let's watch it. I'm not so convinced.
Yeah. Me neither, from what I got from talking to a lot of people, and they basically say it's just more it's statistics with more data and more variables, basically, because you have more computing power to do that. So that's the essence of it. But one of the most interesting points you make, I think, in the paper is you completely change how to view these ethics and AI debate. Because for many now, as you know, the national strategies are being devised and written all over the world, basically, on AI. And you have panels on high-level group on ethics of AI in the European Union. You have a newly formed from Google. You have very different initiatives, all of them centered on ethics. And as we understand it, it's a plus. So we should be, of course, thinking about, a self-driving car, what should it do in the trolley problem, for example, typical situations in which ethics is really, really pragmatically implied. But what he writes, what Paul writes in here, he says that this debate has been actually used to shield us from having a debate on laws of AI. So this is very interesting twist. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of PR or company public relations speech, So, oh yeah, we're doing our best, we're doing some ethics, And if you care, and if you really pay attention to them and you read the documents, you never see human rights mentioned. Because human rights, it's a recognized framework, it's actionable, it's worldwide recognized, it has 60 years of history, 80 years of history. So you're bound by it, Instead, ethics, it's okay, it's great. You give some counseling to some good philosopher or some good, counselor, but it's not exactly what you need. So the idea is, that's also another point you make, where to draw the line between this discussion on ethics and what should be the domain of this discussion of ethics and what should be the domain of discussion instead of regulating by law AI.
Yes, I think in the times of the internet, it was really all John Perry Barlow, the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. We don't want any law, the internet cannot be fragmented. A very anti-democratic discourse. Because if you say the internet globally cannot be fragmented, how do you square that with the fact that in democracies you make laws for your jurisdiction? And then the question is, what's more important? Is it more important that people have the possibility to do self-determination and make laws which also apply to the internet? Or is it more important, above the constitutional right to the democratic self-determination, to have a technological principle, which is the unbroken internet? So I think that was the discourse of the internet, and which led to a huge under-regulation of the internet. And the experience is not good. All the problems we have now with the internet in terms of violence, hate, but also the attitude of the companies, which, they just move on and then later want to ask for forgiveness, but they had an attitude of disrupting the law. Disruptive innovation is modern and it includes disrupting the law. It led to not paying taxes, copyright issues, and so on. But I would say the tide is changing. It was very interesting to read the article of Mark Zuckerberg in the Washington Post on the 30th of March, where he suddenly comes out and says, we need laws. We actually need laws in 4 areas. And he talks about America, of course. First, data protection like GDPR. We need it in America. Second, we need laws drawing the line on content, on free speech. We must draw a line against hate and incitement to violence on the internet. Third, he says he wants to see laws on data portability. And so...
It's a little unexpected there.
Yes, data portability in Europe, we also already have it in the data protection,
of course,
regulation. And so one can ask, why is the tide changing? And I would say, let's assume, like all of us, humans and also organizations can learn. So I would say this is, it's a good statement. The article is going in the right direction. It is always good if companies take responsibility for the public good and for democracy, and if they recognize that in democracy there's a primacy of democracy and law over the markets, and technology. And the ethics debate, I think it was started in the old attitude, there was a lot of money spent, you know, the think tanks, Data and Society in New York, financed by Microsoft, AI Now, financed partially by Google and Microsoft, the AI Alliance, you know, all these industry initiatives, first of all, on ethics. I think they were probably a mixture. There are some people who are very good willing and say, look, you know, if Congress doesn't come up with any laws, at least we need ethics. But there are also the others who devise strategies, and this is the old neoliberal thing, let's avoid laws, how are we going to do it? Oh, we're going to start a discourse on ethics, and you know, lawmakers will understand we don't need a law, we're already dealing with a problem. I think it was a mixture of these two, and that's how it started out. But more and more I hear, even also inside these ethics groups, that of course those who make these ethics catalogue, they don't want to be abused, they don't want to be useful idiots, which serve the neoliberal agenda of not having democratic laws and cutting out parliaments. So I think more and more you can see in these ethics codes, when the texts come out, they say the purpose of this ethics code is not to replace law, but it's the beginning of a thinking process which should lead to law on the one hand, but also to better ethical rules inside the companies. So now to your question, how do you draw the line? How do you decide on what a society needs a law, and on the other hand, what society can leave to ethics code and self-regulation? And there, I would say the classical rule to decide this question is called the rule of essentiality. If something is essential, either to human rights, fundamental rights of individuals, or is essential to the good functioning of society, then we need a law. Why? Because if the things are important to society or to individuals, we need parliaments, legitimate parliaments, to decide with democratic legitimacy, not just some self-appointed or government executive appointed or company appointed ethics boards. No, it must be our representatives of the people who decide. And second, the rules must be enforceable. You know, we are dealing with power here. So these rules must be enforceable even on those who don't want to play ball. And so how does one draw this line in practice in relation to AI? I give you an example. I would say, for example, under the heading of essential for the good functioning of society, that it is inconceivable, in particular in the run-up to elections, that we don't know on the internet, are we talking with a machine or are we talking with a human in an election campaign? Just imagine, you open up your Twitter or Facebook in the morning and you see all these messages in favor of Berlusconi. And you say, wow, everybody around me is in favor of the guy. Well, probably he's good. All machine generated, and you don't know this. This cannot be. So I would say, under the principle of essentiality, we need a rule which is binding on all, that on these networks there must be transparency about whether messages come from a human or from a machine, from a bot. If we don't have that transparency, how can we judge in the democratic debate about situations of majority, minority, and how? So that's one example, and I would think that if we apply this principle, you know, rigorously and in the tradition in which it stands, and it is a constitutional law principle on which also courts have judged, we will come to the right results. And I would say all the points which Mark Zuckerberg mentions in his article, they are already largely subject of legislation in Europe. And under the heading of common values with America, global convergence, it's actually good if in America people also go in this direction. And I stop here by saying Americans, people in America, when you look at opinion polls, they have largely the same concerns as Europeans. For example, snooping. Snooping. Al Gore once called it the stalker business model. Is something which Americans also don't want. 60 to 80% of Americans are really worried about what happens with their personal data. They don't want to be snooped on by the government, and they don't want to be snooped on by big corporate. And so, you know, we see now laws coming up in California and other states which are very much like GDPR, and this is where I end. This may be also a reason why the big corporates now are saying we actually need laws for all of America, because in terms of domestic convergence inside America, inside their home market, for them it's much better to have one law from Washington than 50 different laws from the states, which they have a history of having, for example, on data security. Data breach notification rules in America are completely dispersed between states. It's a mess. So that might be another reason of the change of tone which we are seeing in the discourse.
I agree on that. But let's say the EU comes up with some very good legislation around AI, and let's say that the US and China, they don't. Will the EU, with its trustworthy, essential approach, would it be competitive with these other two giants at worldwide scale? I mean, like China is investing big in 2030, wants to lead the world on AI development, and we do know that the approach to legislation there and human rights is a bit more relaxed. Let's put it like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, everybody now wants to lead the world in AI. Yeah? Any national strategy, EU strategy, member state strategy, worldwide, every country says we want to be leaders on AI. Let's all try. But one thing is also clear: if you want to scale your technology globally, the Chinese model certainly doesn't work. And you see it right now in the discussions on hardware, on the discussions on Huawei. Yeah? And this discussion obviously will also apply to programs, softwares, networks, which you roll out, virtual networks and so on. And I think China is starting to understand that. So I would say we can be very self-confident. Europe is still a very, very big player. On GDPR, certainly our high standards are becoming the norm worldwide. Everybody looks at our laws, and we are becoming the standard to comply with in the one business model which you roll out worldwide. Yeah? So if you want to make money worldwide with one business model, which is the most efficient in the digital economy, you go with the highest standard. And I would say the good thing in Europe is we don't just do these standards to annoy the companies and to protect human rights. We actually do them in a way which are very conducive to make money. It is not true that with GDPR you cannot make money. On the contrary, we make these laws to make the internal market of 500 million people work. And we have a long history of doing this, breaking down the domestic fragmentation, which in America continues between the states. We break it down with rules like GDPR, which are applicable all over Europe. And, actually our companies have a history of doing quite well. I mean, I have no problem to defend that with rising wealth in many parts of the world, people will more and more wake up to data protection and privacy also being an element of quality of service and quality of product. And even in some American companies, the data protection officer today is paid for by the marketing people, because they have understood that marketing to the client and saying, we don't screw you with the data, we are fair, we will leave you the control of the data, you can close down your account anytime, you have control of over what's happening. It's a selling point, not for everyone and not the most important, but it is for some companies, and they're quite good. I mean, look at Apple, the aggressive stance of Apple on data protection and privacy. And the same will be true for AI. For example, explainability. There are technologists who say, guys, you just have to accept from now on, these programs are so good, we cannot explain how they work and how they come to the conclusions, and you shouldn't ask for an explanation, because the complexity is so high you will never understand it, but the program is good, use it. I think it's not going to fly. It will not fly in many areas, because responsible businessmen and responsible people, for example, for data security, if you have a responsibility in a company for data security, nobody who's not totally out of their mind will have a program which learns and mutates and which you don't understand. I mean, if you take responsibility for security in the company, you must understand how these programs work. And the same is true for individuals. Decisions towards individuals without reasons, without explanation, that's just not how we live. We are used to be explained why a certain decision has been taken. And this is typically a point where I would say we are on the right track. We are very clear in the European Commission communication on AI. We want explainable AI, and if it's not explainable, it certainly cannot be used by the government. That's absolutely clear. In the human rights area, government just taking decisions without explanation, it's inconceivable, because government, after all, acts under the control of judges, and judges cannot control government if government is not obliged to give explanations. So that's totally clear. But I would say also in private business, nobody will get away with just saying, you know, just accept it. Yeah. So I think we are working on a sustainable model for technology, and sustainability in this context means also acceptability for people and society. And I think we're on a quite good path in Europe. The constant whining about, you know, oh, we're not as good as China. Well, the reality of AI in China, and after I stop, is 30% less investment in AI in 2018 compared to 2017, if one can believe the Financial Times. And one reason for this reduction, supposedly, is exactly this concern of global financial markets, that Chinese way of doing a rule-less and ethic-less AI will not scale. And the interesting thing is, now suddenly China starts working hard on ethics and law for AI.
Interesting. My last point before opening it to the audience is that, of course, the challenge there concerning explainability is to make it usefully explainable. So, I mean, like, you need to explain an algorithm in such a way that is useful for both technologists who wonders that, for a legislator, but also for the common user that is affected by those decisions. And do you have any clue on how it could happen? Because for what I read, we have a lot of, the principle is clear to me, the way in which it will be implemented is not. So,
I would say this is, of course, a new complexity, but the key word here is meaningful explanation. So you have to do an explanation which your recipient can understand. And this new complexity actually can benefit from experience with other complexities in the past in similar situations. I give you an example, medicine. If you go and, you know, to the pharmacy and you buy a medicine on prescription, a complicated medicine, combined of many elements, you get an information sheet which gives you the basic risks, but it doesn't give you the handbook of all the research and the formulas and the statistics which may be available to the surgeon. You could get it, you could ask for it, but it's not useful for you. So what one has to ask here is that, let's say, towards supervisory authorities or towards those who have to check on the safety, security and compliance of the program with principles of rule of law, fundamental rights and democracy, of course, the full algorithm and also the data pod and its provenance and so on have to be disclosed, and the handbook must be handed over, and you need also control technologies. But towards the layman affected, may not be a user, just affected, and the users, you need a meaningful explanation, in the same way meaningful as the piece of paper we are getting with the medicine, who tells us about the benefits and the risks in a way that we can make our own judgment about it. I think that's what it is about. I think it's absolutely doable. If we can do it for medicine, we can also do it for AI.
Thanks. If there are questions, it's the right time to... Okay, we have many. Couple here in the front, one in the back. Okay.
And the lady.
Mario?
Right.
Oh, okay. Later. Okay.
The lady on the right. You have to take her.
Okay.
Okay.
The right.
First question here.
Hi, that's a really good talk. Thank you so much for that. My name's Tony, and I write for Data IQ. You mentioned that ethicless AI will not scale; it won't go forward. And in the case of public services, where AI is being brought in and isn't necessarily being understood by the people that are using it, how long will it take for the public service people to properly make sure that they have explainability in there when it's being rolled out?
Yeah. So first of all, I think our expectations towards compliance with rules has to be realistic. There will always be people who try to make money in the gray area or illegally. So, I'm not saying the world is or will be perfect, but I think there will be a trend in this direction, like there is now a trend towards, in the American debate on data protection and privacy, there's a trend. How long will it take? I think we can already see in the last 2 years that the discourse on non-explainability has been calmed down because, of course, companies want to be ready to sell to the government and to the state. So I think on specific narrow AI, there are already programs which can explain, and there will be more. And on the broader forms of general AI, if we ever move in this direction, of course, it's a new complexity. But I would say it's not a now nothing and tomorrow everything. It's a flowing process where more and more products will come online which actually are fulfilling the requirement of explanation.
That's right. Just one here and there, and then in the back.
You say there are wide opportunities both for the good and for the bad. As far as I read, I believe maybe the good is more toward healthcare and so on, but a bit pessimistic about information, which unfortunately nowadays is crucial. Because, for example, I've been reading that they're already making huge progresses, for example, for videos. We saw, for example, Obama saying something like about Trump. Unfortunately, it was a fake video in that case, but I mean, since it seems that always the one who speaks first speaks twice, and it's so fast nowadays, no? And in fact, it can affect the elections and so on. I'm afraid, and I read as well that already some important press is making much money in working for AI in order to to fight against the bad use of AI. And so I'm afraid of kind of arms race in the AI, where the money gets to fight against the minacce, threats, yes. While it's so important, so crucial to have money for paying the journalists and having good information. So I would like to know your point of view about.
Yes, I think this is exactly the problem we are dealing with now, that we cannot leave this digital sphere, this public electronic sphere, which now becomes our source of information, just to the market and technologists. Because then what you say is exactly happening. So what we need is, on the one hand, we need legal rules, but on the other hand, we also need public investments, for example, in control technologies, meaning technologies which allow individuals and sometimes also the government to check on what's happening, to understand. So I think you are rightly describing the risk, and I would say it's not a small risk. I have no golden bullet solution, but I would say there must be a resolve with the usual methods of rule of law and investing in public interest research and technology to address this issue. And the purpose of the law must be to set the incentives right. If you have an internet where clicks are driven by dirty and radical content, and therefore, if you want to make money, you allow more and more dirty and radical content because it excites people and brings more clicks, that's a wrong incentive. So, we have to work on this. And I would say in the end it will be a combination of laws, technology, and also some own responsibility of the big players on the internet, which brings us hopefully in the right direction. But I would also say the situation will never be perfect. We live in a world where daily people don't pay their taxes, small and big. We live in a world in which products are falsified and, you know, copyright, intellectual property are broken, you know, murder takes place. So let's also not think that we will reach perfection on the internet. We will not.
Down there.
I wonder, the European Commission has done a lot on antitrust in the controlling digital platform field. But I think that more could be done in that direction. But if we redefine what the market is, I mean, perhaps there is a market answer to the issues that you raised. If we redefine the market, if the market is data, the industry is a data industry. Google, of course, is not just in the search business, it's not just a self-autopilot car business or domotics business, it's a data business, and so on. So perhaps the regulations we are seeking could be rules on how and if and when companies can cross-exchange data, apart from privacy rules. I mean, data as such. And I think this could be perhaps a good point to start.
Well, I mean, this is exactly what GDPR is about, because it limits the ability to just pass on data and exchange them. And we have a problem of under enforcement right now. You know, it's a still young law, and the authorities which are called upon to enforce this law, you know, they have to get their acts together and become as rigorous as enforcement as some competition authorities in Europe are. On competition, I would just say it takes a long time, because these cases must be documented in such a way that you win afterwards the court battle. On every big competition decision, the companies go to the last instance, and that's why it takes time. Google has by now paid 8.3 billion euros in fines in different decisions of the European Union. We have a big decision on Apple paying no taxes in Ireland. They have to pay 11 billion taxes in Ireland under a Commission decision. So these are big cases, but even if we could accelerate them a little bit and we try our best, it will still only be, let's say, the very, very big companies and very, very big cases. Many other things which also happen in the market and can become a problem, a lot of free riding, cannot be apprehended by competition law. So it's really, let's say, last resort, and therefore I think you are right. We have to think of more systemic regulation. But that's a very, very complex issue, and making this regulation, as you can see in GDPR, takes time. You know, GDPR, the whole process, 6 years. 2 years of preparation, public consultation, 4 years of legislative negotiations. I don't see a golden bullet to make it much faster, because, you know, you need to deliberate complex issues of great societal importance.
Question there, and then one from...
Hello, I'm Claudio Agosti of...
last one there.
Of Algorithm Exposed. And since your opening statement, you were talking on how we should have a proper regulation. This means that we should have a proper informed debate on how AI works. And we lack of this knowledge. At the moment, policymakers are only informed by lobbyists, basically. So I came from the academy and research, and we are working to explain AI to individuals and also to help what is data-driven policymaking. The most typical criticism I receive is that we are going to maybe violate the term of service or try to open some kind of complex system that is protected by intellectual properties. My actual question is which kind of protection can I expect from institutions in Europe when I'm fostering this kind of research? Because we need to understand what is behind the scene, and these companies are not coming to us to tell us how they work. We have to do independent analysis and speak in the public interest.
Yes, I think what you address is really a huge problem, which is that a lot of this research on this core technology is now concentrated inside the walls of the companies, and the rule of thumb seems to be sort of, each of these companies spends 10 billion a year, around 3,000 people working on this, and we really don't know what is happening inside these walls. They claim that they make publicly available their fundamental research, and there's a lot of publications, and all this is true, but it's a small part of the research which is taking place behind closed doors. What to do about it? This is very difficult, and the frustration goes very, very deep. I mean, my experience is that at American universities, the professors there, they tell the following story. They said, when I was a PhD and left the university and said goodbye to my professor who had brought me to where I am, and I started working, afterwards, after a year, and I came back, and from time to time I visited my old professor, and I told him or her what I was doing in my job, and he found it interesting, or she found it interesting, the professor, to learn from the PhDs. This learning is completely broken. All the people who go to these companies, they don't come back to the university and talk to their elder professors. So we have a real transparency problem in research. And I would say, in politics, it's very simple. If the discontent rises, there will be consequences. And this intransparency, unfortunately, is compounded with a culture of too much lying, just not telling the truth about capabilities, which could be in the public interest. For example, can we detect hate speech and incitement to violence automatically on the internet? Do we have the capacity, yes or no? It's a simple question. So I think these issues of lying to the lawmaker or to the regulator, and of intransparency on matters of public interest, are issues which are central to the technological society into which we are moving, and they need to be addressed with rigor, and I would say with law. For example, on the lying, we have an instrument in Europe. The European Commission can impose a fine if big companies in a merger proceeding lie to us. So for example, Facebook received a fine of 110 million for not telling the true story about the integration of their intention of integrating the accounts from WhatsApp and Facebook with the telephone numbers. So in competition law, we can do it. But if we are lied to blatantly in the legislative process, we can do nothing so far. And I would say that's a real lacune. And what you are saying is also right. Researchers should have access to much of the research and also much of the data. Because today, to do journalism science, sociology, psychology, how can you do it without the raw data from Facebook and Google? And many of the people, the Reuters Institute in Oxford, Phil Howard, he regularly complains about lack of access to data. So I think this is becoming a huge issue, and I would just say, let's get organized and let's make this a rolling political snowball, which will become bigger and bigger. And eventually, the rules will have to be made if the companies don't play ball.
Yeah. There was a very last question, very quick one. There's no time for it? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. So thanks, everybody, and hopefully see you again at the festival.
Thank you. It was very good.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
It's also very important for journalists, this issue of access. Yes.
I personally asked them.